Hello, folks. Thank you so much for joining me. I am Joel Keenan, an internist practicing in southern Maine. I graduated from Tufts University and then from the University of Vermont Medical School. Completed my internship and residency at Yale University and have been in private practice here for the last 20 years. I gave this talk, the one I'm about to give to you now, a couple of nights ago at the York Harbor Inn. I'm doing exactly the same show this afternoon in my living room because you'll hear the audio and the video, the slides, much more clearly than you would have from the video I taped a couple of nights ago. So this show is about preventing heart disease and better diagnosing people at risk for it. And you might be thinking, that sounds pretty grim, a doctor talking about our leading cause of death. Well, guess what? This show is good news. Heart disease is totally solvable, and I'm going to tell you how. And we're going to have all kinds of fun in the next 45 minutes doing it. You will hear about Sean Connery, Humphrey Bogart, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. You'll get a quiz question. You'll all get 100. You'll hear about the battle for Guadalcanal, the FBI hostage rescue team, 8 dead congressmen, 9 dead senators, the 1960s, and the Flintstones. What do all those things have to do with heart disease? Stay tuned. I'll tell you right now. Suppose I told you that just a few days ago, there came to the United States a brand new disease that was destined to kill a quarter of us. And there's basically nothing we can do about that. That's the whole story. Sorry. You might say to that, wait a minute, a couple of questions. What happened just a few days ago? And how do we fix it? I'm going to give the answers to those questions now. So first of all, what happened just a few days ago? And why am I suggesting that heart disease is a brand new problem, just a few days old, when we know that atherosclerosis, the thing that causes most forms of heart disease, has been with us for at least 4,000 years? We know that because of this mummy seen here getting a CT at York Hospital, and you can tell by the look on his face he just found out he's self-pay. Over 65, yes, but no Medicare. He's visiting from Egypt. He summers in New England. Here's what his coronary artery calcium scan showed. You see those little yellow dots denoted by the arrows? Those are calcifications of atherosclerotic plaque in the arteries of this mummy. And you might be thinking, gee, Dr. Keenan, why all this concern about atherosclerotic mummies? Don't you care about daddies? Well, of course we do, but that's not my point. My point is these people, the healthiest people who ever lived, our hunter-gatherer forebears, from 2 million years ago to the present day, did not die from heart disease. You can tell that just by looking at them, but you might be thinking, not so fast. 2 million years ago is a long time. They didn't know anything about heart disease then. They didn't know they had hearts then. How would you know they didn't die from it? 2, the life expectancy then was a lot shorter, maybe 35 years old. They probably didn't live long enough to get heart disease. For me to be sure that hunter-gatherers did not die from heart disease, I'd have to be able to study hunter-gatherers alive and well today, living now, just as they did 2 million years ago. And we'd have to get a sample of them, say of a community of 16,700 participants, to leave their hunter-gatherer community and go to the nearest hospital and have a coronary artery calcium score and see if they have atherosclerosis. And then you'd want to look back at the last 50 deaths that you could record or keep note of and see how many of those hunter-gatherers actually did die from heart disease. You'd also want to know that that hunter-gatherer community lived long enough to get heart disease, up to, let's say, 94 years old, with an average age of death at about 70 years. In other words, a lot of old hunter-gatherers who could have gotten heart disease if they wanted to. Do we have a cohort like that? Has a study been done on people like that? And if so, where are they? There they are. In Bolivia. Take 95 south to Key West, go to Cuba, get a ferry to Venezuela, take an Uber to Bolivia, and there you will find the Chimene hunter-gatherers, 16,000 hunter-gatherers living on the Manatee River in the Bolivian rainforest. That's on the edge of the Amazon rainforest. And among those 16,000 people, 700 of them were sampled to see if they had atherosclerosis. And they did have long lifespans. A quarter of those tested were over 65. The modal or most common age of death for them was 70 years. So it's really relevant data. What did that study of 705 hunter-gatherers in the Bolivian rainforest living well past the age of 70 show? It showed that 97% of them had no atherosclerosis or clinically insignificant atherosclerosis. Not 1%, but one person in that cohort had a significantly elevated coronary artery calcium score, suggesting significant atherosclerosis. And when they did a sample of 50 adult deaths to see how did these people die in the prior 5 years, there was one death due to probable heart attack. And that person, by the way, was not somebody who was sneaking out of the jungle to go to Dunkin' Donuts every day. These hunter-gatherers, as many did, had high inflammatory disease burdens, especially parasite infections. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it's inflammation, also called oxidative stress, that is really at the basis of atherosclerosis. So it's fair to say our ancestors of 2 million years ago did not die from heart disease. And you might think, well, what about 10,000 years ago at the birth of agriculture? That's when it must have kicked in. No, it did not. 2,000 years ago at the birth of Christ, how about then? No. The Renaissance, 600 years ago, no. In 1850, the death rate from heart disease in the United States accounted for less than 1% of total deaths. This is a brand new problem. So what happened then? From 1850 to 1900, something did happen. The rate rose a little bit to 8%, almost an order of magnitude, still a small minority of total deaths. And then the incidence of heart disease in the United States exploded until by 1963, it accounted for 40% of all deaths. In 1 year, in 1958, 8 congressmen died of heart attacks. Nebraska, in a 3-year period, went through 9 U.S. senators. It was an absolute catastrophe, an explosion in death from heart disease. Again, up to 1850, this was a truly negligible cause of death. And then all of a sudden, it overwhelmed us. So, what happened? Well, a few things. Above all, with the advent of the 20th century came the advent of the sedentary lifestyle. Cars made a huge difference in our level of daily activity. 2, in 1900, the average American smoked about 54 cigarettes a year. By 1960, when 40% of all adults were smoking, that number had increased almost 100-fold. Third, this man, Henry John Fenton, a brilliant British biochemist, in 1894 discovered the reaction that bears his name that yielded something called the hydroxyl radical. That's a reactive oxygen species that we'll talk about more in a few minutes, an inflammatory mediator that's essential in causing atherosclerosis. And you might be thinking, Dr. Keenan, Fenton discovered the reaction yielding the hydroxyl radical. He didn't invent it. The hydroxyl radical must have been around for thousands, probably millions of years. You're absolutely right. That's true. But that same year, in 1894, 2 brothers in Battle Creek, Michigan, invented and started distributing this, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. And that year marked really the advent of the mass production and distribution of refined and processed carbohydrates in the U.S. and in the rest of the developed world, culminating in 1957 with the production of high fructose corn syrup, which became ubiquitous in the American diet in the 1970s. So we had this huge influx of atherogenic food, of food that causes heart disease in the 20th century. And that's not all. that food wasn't just presented to us, it was marketed to us really, really well. As you know, these guys are pros. And if you were to look at some of the most popular cereals that you and I might have been familiar with as kids, and that kids are familiar with today, you can just see among those, if you're to ask yourself, which of these is likeliest to be good for us, it's a no-brainer, right? Frosted Flakes and Lucky Charms and Fruit Loops and Captain Crunch are all about having a party loaded with sugar, targeted at kids, no question about it. The cereal that's clearly meant to be portrayed as good for us is on the right. It's the Special K, right? And we know for at least 3 reasons we think that food is good for us. 1, it's named after a vitamin. 2, it's not an ordinary vitamin, it's special. And 3, look at the box. Nothing could be more depressing than that box. That's the box of cereal you're going to buy if you're walking into a grocery store thinking, I don't want to die, what should I have for breakfast? Special K is designed for us. It's for people who want to be healthy and will put up with it as long as it works, right? That's the message we get from that box. So what's in it? Let's take a look. Its main ingredient is rice. That's a refined grain. That's a refined and processed carbohydrates. Next, you see whole wheat. Guess what? That's not whole wheat. It's only whole wheat if it says 100% whole wheat. That can be any percentage of whole wheat to be included in that quantity. Third most prominent ingredient, sugar. If sugar accounts for just 6% of what's in that box, and I'll bet you it's more than that, they're not telling, but I'll bet you it is, that's 90% of what's in that box is a refined and processed carbohydrate. This food is not good for us, and it's marketed as the healthiest breakfast food there is. By the way, you want to know where Special K is made? There's the plant in Memphis. Doesn't that make you want to pull up with a bowl and a spoon and say, what's for breakfast? That's where that food is coming from. So that's what was going on with food production in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. Meanwhile, what was the government telling us to do? The USDA in the 1940s had this advice for what we should eat. We should eat from each of 7 food groups. Look at them. One of those food groups is butter. And then, when you're done eating from each of those 7 food groups, eat any other foods you want, it says at the bottom of the cartoon. Wow, that's impressive. It's really no wonder that the 20th century produced the best food to eat if you want to have a heart attack. Those sesame seeds and pickles don't stand a chance against all that saturated fat in the meat and cheese, the sugar in the sauce, the refined and processed carbohydrates in the buns. It's just a nightmare. And that's what that's what a lot of us grew up with. So what happened then? That's how we got to where we were in 1963. No heart attacks to speak of in 1850, 40% of total deaths in 1963. What happened since then? Well, good news. The incidence of death from heart disease dropped by almost half, from 40 to about 25%. How did that happen? A number of things. Mainly, I think, there was a big drop by about half in the incidence of smoking, the prevalence of smoking cessation, and the advent in the 1970s and 80s of statins, beta blockers, other meds called ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, of course, low-dose aspirin for people who would benefit from that. All these meds really helped reduce death from heart disease, as well as bypass grafts and stenting. So a lot of new stuff came into the medical field that did make a difference. While that was happening in the second part of the 20th century, what was the USDA advising about food intake? Well, they came up with some good ideas. Three of them, in fact. They said, limit saturated fat, limit refined and processed carbohydrates, and eat more fruits and vegetables. Phenomenal advice. Got right to the heart of the problem. Should be problem solved, right? Well, what did we do in response to that advice? From 1970 to 2010, take a look at the bar on the left, grain products. Those are refined and processed carbohydrates. The intake went up dramatically. Same thing, the second 2 bars from the left, of total unsaturated fats increased dramatically over that 40-year period. And look, please, over at the right-hand side of that graph. See vegetables and fruit way over on the right? They were a tiny proportion of our caloric intake in 1970, and they didn't budge over the next 40 years. What have we been doing? We've been eating refined and processed carbohydrates, food rich in fat, and neglecting fruit and vegetables all this time. And I think that's a big part of the reason why heart disease incidence dropped by half, but remains our leading cause of death today. About a quarter of all deaths are due to cardiovascular disease, actually a little bit over that. So that's what happened. And how should we think about that history of heart disease? Just to summarize, for 2 million years, we human beings had no problem at all. And then all of a sudden, in the space of a few minutes, really, in the scheme of our species' history, heart disease flourished and became by far our leading cause of death, accounting for 40% of all deaths in 1963. And then it dropped almost by half to about 25% where it is today. How should we think about that? I'm asking because how we approach it, how we view that, how we feel about it, will have a lot to do with how aggressive we are in solving that problem. Here's one way to look at it. I was a couple of years out of residency when a colleague of mine, a great doctor, fascinating guy, said to me in a hallway at York Hospital, "Joel, we're living in the golden age of cardiology." That was not an off-the-wall statement. That reflected then and now the consensus of the medical community, and I think the community at large. Why did he think that? He thought that because we had just come off the heels of cutting the rate of death from heart disease almost by half. That was a stunning accomplishment. But ladies and gentlemen, you can't call something the golden age unless you're sanguine about it, unless it's a good time to live in. That's what golden age means. And we're living in an age when a quarter of all deaths are due to heart disease. The implication of calling this era the golden age is that that's acceptable, that that's just the cost of doing business. And it wouldn't be the first time that the medical community has said something that's not good for us is actually okay, or acceptable, or tolerable. Listen, I'm all for accepting things that we can't do anything about. You and I know that popular music is awful and will be to the day we die. The Great American Songbook came and went 75 years ago, and that was it. Those days are over, and they're not coming back. We're adults. That's part of being an adult, accepting things that are just true. But what if I told you that there was a bank robbery and somebody took 50 hostages at the bank? And you know what would happen in that circumstance. The police would call the FBI, and they'd tell the FBI, "We've got a bank robbery and there are 50 hostages." And the hostage rescue team would say, "Oh my goodness, we'll be right there." And they would be right there. They'd come over and do what the hostage rescue team does, right? They'd get to know the robbers, and they'd bring pizza and soda, and they turn the AC on, they turn it off, they turn it on, and 12, 18, 24 hours later, 25 of those hostages are released. They've reduced the incidence of hostages by half. That's phenomenal. But what you and I would not expect would be for the FBI to go home and say, "We got half of them out, that's great, we're pooped, bye everybody." That would not be okay with us. We don't accept any hostages. We don't accept bank robberies. We insist that those things don't happen. And so, very rarely, they happen. My suggestion today to you folks is that that is exactly how we ought to view heart disease. This brand new disease from which we were completely exempt for almost our entire history and are now plagued with. Although not as much in 1963, it is still our leading cause of death. We ought to be able to do better than that. So, how do we do better than that? The main thing to solve heart disease, prevent it and solve it when it's present, is to find and heal oxidative stress. So what's oxidative stress? First of all, it's at the basis of a lot of disease states, but I'm just going to focus this afternoon on how it relates to heart disease. And I know what you might be thinking. Well, here comes the medical terminology. I'm not so sure about this. I might be ready to tune out. Please don't. Please know that 5 minutes from now, you and I will understand together on an atomic and molecular level the basis for atherosclerosis, the thing that causes heart disease. And because we understand that, you will be able to tell me, by way of our only quiz question, how we prevent it. That's coming in 5 minutes, okay? So bear with me. Here we go. That's John Mazziata. He was my high school chemistry teacher in 1976. Mr. Maz, as we called him, was a great teacher. I used to go see him just about every morning for extra help, and he was always there. And a great man. He served in World War II in the Pacific Theater, including at Guadalcanal. Men, Mr. Mazziata used to tell us, all atoms want to be happy, and happy atoms are stable atoms. 4 minutes until our quiz. What did he mean by that? He meant that those blue atoms in the upper left corner of that diagram are stable and happy because they have a complete complement of electrons in their outer ring, and those electrons are in pairs. Now, it can happen that atoms or molecules lose one of the electrons in their outer ring, and then they look like the red atoms in the lower left corner of the screen. And those are somewhat unstable atoms, also called radicals or free radicals, or if they bear oxygen, reactive oxygen species, ROS for short sometimes. Now, you and I might understand at our age that a healthy life is one lived in balance. And if you think that's true, please know it's true at the atomic level too. Those reactive oxygen species that are in search of an electron are good for us. They are not bad for us. They're used in intercellular signaling. They're used to fight infection. They're used for breathing at the end of the electron transport chain. They only need to be balanced by atoms that are rich in electrons and have one to spare, and those are called antioxidants, denoted by the green atom in the upper right corner. As long as reactive oxygen species, red atoms at the bottom, and antioxidants rich in electrons, green atoms in the upper right, as long as those are in relative balance with each other, the net result is Mr. Mazziata's stable, happy atom, because the antioxidant can donate an electron to the reactive oxygen species. The problem comes 2 minutes until our quiz. When there are too many reactive oxygen species in search of an electron and not enough antioxidants that can donate an electron. When that imbalance happens, that is oxidative stress. That defines oxidative stress. And what happens when there's that imbalance? What happens when there's oxidative stress? A lot of things, but just in terms of focusing on heart disease, it is essential in completing each step required for heart disease. Those 3 steps are, first, atherosclerosis formation, plaque formation in the lining of arteries. Second, disruption of that plaque and rupture of what's called a fibrous cap at its outer edge. And third, the formation of a thrombus or a clot that forms and that can cause heart attacks or strokes at the end of that process. All 3 of those steps require a state of oxidative stress, a surfeit of reactive oxygen species for that to occur. You can have all the cholesterol in the world. If you don't have oxidative stress, you don't get atherosclerosis, destabilized plaque, and thrombus causing heart attacks. So again, 1 minute until our quiz. What is oxidative stress? It's too many reactive oxygen species and not enough antioxidants. And doesn't that make you think, wouldn't it be great? It probably could never happen. It's too perfect, it's too beautiful, but wouldn't it be great if all the antioxidants we needed were just in food, and all you and I needed to do to be healthy is eat food. That would be so, oh my goodness, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Here's your quiz question. Which of these prevents heart disease? Yes, you are absolutely right. All those foods prevent heart disease. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, dark chocolate, coffee, all those things are rich in antioxidants. All of them prevent oxidative stress and therefore heart disease. So you might be thinking, gee, how effective could food possibly be? I mean, it's out there everywhere. We all could be eating healthy food. How much is this going to reduce our risk for heart disease? 10%? 20%? Does it cut the risk by half? Let's talk about that. Let's look at 3 quick studies, just a minute each, and they'll describe for us just how effective healthy food and moderate exercise can be in reducing heart disease. Here we go, 3 minutes. In 2010, the American Heart Association does a meta-analysis, a study of studies, looking at what happens to people who live healthy lives, who eat healthy food, go for a walk 25 minutes a day, keep their total cholesterol below 200, their systolic pressure below 120, their fasting glucose below 100, and are eating basically a lot of fruit and vegetables and fish and not too many sugar-sweetened beverages, although even with this cohort, they're allowed to drink up to 3 12-ounce Cokes a day. By the way, do you know that USDA guidelines would permit each of us to drink a can of Coke every day of the year and still meet USDA guidelines? That's just terrible. I don't want to get distracted, but my goodness, it's just appalling advice. Anyway, these people who did those 7 things, their risk for heart attack plummeted, dropped by 90%. And by the way, their risk for cancer was reduced by half. Second study, 20,000 men followed prospectively for 11 years. And those 20,000 men do 5 things. They eat basically a Mediterranean diet rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, limiting red and processed meat, full-fat cheese, refined carbohydrates, and sweets. They didn't drink too much. They were allowed to have alcohol, but just not too much. They didn't smoke or had quit 20 years ago. And they did moderate exercise, 40 minutes of walking a day and an hour a week of vigorous exercise, and they kept their waist circumference below 37.5 inches. What happened to those men? Their risk of heart attack dropped by 80%, a stunning drop. What about women? Do we have a study focusing on women? Yes. 90,000 women followed for 20 years, and they do the same set of things, basically healthy diet, maintain a healthy weight, reasonably active, limit television viewing to about an hour or less a day, limit alcohol. What happened to them? Their risk of heart attack dropped by 92%. Just stunning. How do these non-pharmacologic interventions compare to drugs? Prior to the advent of statins, niacin was the most effective med to reduce risk for heart disease, reduce it by about 11%. Statins came on the market by a quarter. They reduced risk for heart disease, and aspirin by a third for people at risk for heart disease. That compares to just about 90% risk reduction by eating healthy food and going for a walk. And look, we're going to talk in the next couple of minutes about how to identify who's really at risk for heart disease, because that does vary among us, no matter what we do. But if you want to see your risk for heart disease plummet, just do 2 things. Go for a walk every day and make most of lunch and dinner fruit and vegetables, particularly vegetables for lunch and dinner. Just do those 2 things, and you're just so far better off. It's stunning. Okay, so we really just talked about how to prevent oxidative stress by eating healthy food and doing moderate exercise. What about finding people who are subject to oxidative stress? How can we better define who's really at risk for heart disease? And you might be thinking, well, what about cholesterol? I thought that's how you decide who's at risk for heart disease. You're not alone if that's what you think. The three major risk calculators used to predict people's risk for heart disease, Framingham, Reynolds, and ACC-AHA, all depend on the standard cholesterol profile, total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides, to determine who's at risk. And there is some value in those calculations, but there's a huge cost in limiting your inquiry to the lipid profile. We know this because half of all people hospitalized for heart attacks had normal cholesterol when they were admitted. That's stunning. That means we can't depend on a lipid profile at all to really judge who is at risk for heart disease. We've got to do much better than that. And we can. We can certainly do the standard cholesterol profile, but we can also look at the particles carrying cholesterol. In particular, among those on the right, I won't take you through every one of them, but the apolipoprotein B100 is a great marker. So is the LDLP to HDLP ratio. Those of you in my practice know that we depend on these to better define people's heart disease risk. The lipoprotein insulin resistance score, or LPIR score, is an early heads up for people at risk for insulin resistance, which is the basis for one of our most popular and growing diseases, type 2 diabetes. And those inflammatory markers, myeloperoxidase and C-reactive protein, are really helpful because inflammation is absolutely at the heart of atherosclerosis. So we can do this with labs. We can better assess people at risk. But that's not all. We can look directly at our arteries and see, is there atherosclerosis? Wow, you can do that? You can look directly at the arteries? Yeah, you can, and I'll show you how. Here's one way, and it's not the way I want you to use. This is by way of an autopsy photo. This is a cross-section of an atherosclerotic artery. That white area in the upper left as you're looking at it is plaque, and it can cause a thrombus. And there's another autopsy view, and that causes a heart attack. Let's back up for a minute and look at how atherosclerosis forms so we can better understand what we're looking for. So here's a healthy artery, and that silver part is the first of three parts of the lining of an artery's wall called the intima. The red part is not blood. Those are smooth muscle cells called the media. And the adventitia is a connective tissue layer on the outside of the artery. What can and does happen to all of us is oxidized or inflamed LDL cholesterol can get wedged between the intima and media, and that can cause what's sometimes called a fatty streak or an atheroma. That's plaque, and it looks like that. Note that plaque is not obstructing the flow of blood. The problem is almost always not an obstruction of blood flow because of the plaque, but that the plaque wall can rupture. And when that happens, then a thrombus forms. And that thrombus can look like that, and that's the end of it. That's all there is to it. There's no heart attack or stroke. There's just a rupture and a thrombus. That's the far more common event, by the way. But what can also happen is that thrombus progresses. And if it does sufficiently to block the flow of blood, then it's blocking oxygen to the tissue surrounding it, and that is, by definition, a heart attack or a stroke. So that's what we don't want to happen. Now I want to look at this slide with you and kind of simplify it if I can. There are only two parts of it I'd really want to focus on. One is on the left where you see that yellow plaque where it says 70% of all vulnerable plaque. And the other is on the far right side of that longitudinal view of vulnerable plaque where it's narrowing the flow of blood. If you would, disregard all the cross-sectional slices in the bottom of the slide because we don't need to go into that. Let's just talk for a minute about the difference between the right-hand side of that cartoon and the left-hand side. What I'd like you to know is this. It is certainly true that people can have heart attacks who have that blockage on the right-hand side where plaque has progressed so much that it's blocking the flow of blood relatively. What I mean by that is it's blocking it sufficiently that if you're under exertion, if you're going up a flight of stairs, if you're doing a workout, if you're lifting something heavy, now you're going to feel shortness of breath or left chest pain or pain in your neck or your jaw radiating to the left arm. You're going to feel relative ischemic symptoms because with that relative blockage seen on the right side of the cartoon, there's impaired blood flow even though there's no thrombus. Make sense? That is called angina when that's happening. It's not a heart attack or a stroke yet, but it's really at risk for one, as you could imagine. And that kind of lesion seen in the right side of the cartoon, an atheroma that's almost blocking the flow of blood, that will be evident on a stress test because a stress test is designed to elicit symptoms when that kind of plaque is present. What a stress test won't do is identify the plaque on the left side of that cartoon, and that's unfortunate because that is the more commonly ruptured kind of plaque, that soft, vulnerable plaque that is not obstructing the flow of blood. That's the plaque most likely to lead to a thrombus. Why do I care about that? Because of what happened to this man, Tim Russert. He had a normal stress test and 8 weeks later died at work of a heart attack. Why did that happen to Tim Russert? It happened because his thrombus occurred on the left side of that cartoon where the soft, non-obstructing, vulnerable plaque was. That plaque, again, would not show up on a stress test. So that begs the question, how do we identify it? It's lurking there, like this cat in a gutter seen in a park in Amsterdam. That is a dangerous cat with respect to those pigeons, and they have no idea what's in for them. They think everything's okay because the cat is not visible. But they're wrong. And that's a good analogy because it really leads us to the question, can we identify that non-obstructing thrombus? Can we find the cat in the gutter? And the answer is yes, we can. We can do a carotid intima media thickness test that's looking at the lining of our arteries. So how's that done? That's an ultrasound of the carotid artery. It takes just about 10 minutes. I started doing it in my office over the summer. And here's what it shows you. It shows you a view of your common carotid and internal carotid arteries. And you can see by the labels there, the linings of the artery, the intima, the media, and the adventitia. That's a healthy artery that we're looking at. Here's what it looks like if there's non-obstructing plaque. Just like that. It's in the lining of the wall of the artery. It's not obstructing the flow of blood, but it's visible. It's discernible. So that's what a CIMT can show. What benefit is that, being able to find plaque like that? Let's take a look at that. And I want to tell you now, folks, I'm coming to the last medical study that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, and I'm saving the best for last. This is the most important thing I want you to know. What does a carotid intima media thickness test add to us diagnostically and prognostically? How will it benefit us to have that information? There are a number of studies that answer that question. One of the best is the Café's Cave study that looked at 13,000 low-risk people concerning risk for heart attack. What's low risk mean? They had normal blood pressure and normal cholesterol. So if they were going to calculate their risk by the Framingham or Reynolds or ACC/AHA calculators, all of them would be judged at low risk for a heart attack. Those people, those 13,000 participants, were studied with a CIMT study at the beginning of the study and then followed for 10 years to see what happened to them. Again, these are people who would have been judged low risk for heart disease. They were followed after being studied by a CIMT test. So what happened to them? Again, this is the kind of plaque I'm interested. We'll come back to that in a minute. Here's how I want to describe this graph to you, because this really reports the results of the study. In the x-axis, the horizontal axis, that describes the burden of atherosclerosis. On the left side where it's white, there's no atherosclerosis. And on the right side where it's, I guess that's orange, there's a lot of atherosclerosis, so much that it's blocking the flow of blood, as in the right side of that cartoon I showed you earlier. Okay, so that's what the x-axis describes. How much atherosclerosis is there in the artery that was studied? The y, or vertical axis, describes the likelihood of a heart attack over the next 10 years. And the line that you see drawn describes the relationship between those two variables. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at the left side of that graph. See 0.1? That's saying that people who have no atherosclerosis seen on their CIMT study, none of those people had a heart attack 10 years later. Makes sense, right? And let's look way over on the right side of that graph, again in the orange section, where those people who at the beginning of the study had flow obstructing plaque, sure enough, 80% of them went on to have heart attacks in the next 10 years, just as you would expect. And those would be the people who you would think that if they went to their doctor or they noticed they were having symptoms, it could have been discovered the conventional way, just by reporting it to their physician or having a stress test. What I want to focus on is the salmon-colored cohort to the left of the orange cohort, where it says 39.1. That's describing people with atherosclerosis in the wall of the plaque only, but not obstructing flow. That's Tim Russert's cohort. That's the cohort that people would be in who have no idea they're at risk for heart disease. And sure enough, 40% of those people went on to have heart attacks over the next 10 years. Not for nothing, people who just had some thickening of the intima media lining, about 9% of those went on to have heart attacks. That's a big number if you think about it, over a 10-year period. So what we're really doing is we're missing the people who are clearly at significant risk for heart disease but don't have symptoms. And the CIMT study really offers a really useful way to better identify those people at risk. Well, once we've done that, what else can we do? We've done the Cleveland labs, as they're called, the more sophisticated lipid profile labs, and we've done a CIMT test. We can find and address the root causes of oxidative stress once we found people who have them, and we can treat it accordingly. That's a whole other conversation that I won't bore you with today. I just mean to point out that finding people at risk for heart disease is not a fruitless endeavor. It's a really solvable problem. We'll talk about how to do that another time. So, to summarize, what happened just a few days ago? A disease came into the United States that started killing almost half of us. And how do we fix it? What can we do about it? Better prevention with healthy food and exercise, and better detection. Look for signs of oxidative stress with the more sophisticated labs, including the Cleveland labs, as we call them. There's a method called Bale-Deneen that doctors like me can use to approach people who have oxidative stress in an organized way. And yeah, look for a cat in the gutter. Look for people who have atherosclerosis and are at risk for heart disease but don't know it. And then act according to what we find. That's what we can do. Why is this worth doing? Because a quarter of us are dying from this problem, and it didn't used to be this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. Until just a few minutes ago, none of us had this problem, and now it's our leading cause of death. As I described, this all happened in the last century. It's in our parents' lifetimes that this occurred. This was a calamity that befell them, a catastrophe in lives bordered by catastrophes. They had no idea. They couldn't have known. They accepted it as the cost of doing business and got on with their lives, and so many of them died from this problem. Maya Angelou said, do the best you can until you know better. Then, when you know better, do better. We can do better. In closing, I should tell you this. None of this was my idea. Just brilliant clinicians have been working on this for at least 20 years, chief among them Brad Bale and Amy Deneen, two just fabulous clinicians. I'm grateful to them. I'm a member of their academy and certified in their method of approaching people at risk for heart disease, and to Alan Reisinger, a colleague, just a great doctor and a great friend who kindly connected me with the work of Doctors Bale and Deneen just about a year ago. So thanks to them, and most of all, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to you for taking time out of your day to listen to my talk. I hope you found this helpful and interesting, and thanks so much.